Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the third webinar of National Child Protection Week. I am so thrilled to be joined by some incredible young advocates nationwide. Here with me today to speak about the importance of intersectionality within child protection systems and within prevention education. Now, before I begin, particularly as a refugee immigrant to this country, I would specifically like to pay my respects to any First Nations people joining here today. I'm joining from the Gadigal Nation, and I pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I recognise that it is my role as well to decolonise the land that I stand on. I am so privileged to be surrounded by so many First Nations folks and communities who have really grounded me in some of the learnings that I take on me in decolonising spaces that I am a part of, and it is such an honour to continue learning on this land. I would also now like to invite the incredible Ruben, a Lutruwita from the Lutruwita region, a Pakana man, to also provide an acknowledgement to country. Over to you, Ruben.
Thank you so much, Zara, for that beautiful acknowledgement that you just gave. As a Pakana man, as an Aboriginal man, it's very important for me that I do the same. So, Ya Palingana Namapali, that means hello and welcome everyone in my language. I'd like to acknowledge that I live and work on Muanina country, and that's where I'm joining you all from today. So Muanina country is just in Nipaluna, Hobart. I'd like to pay my deepest respects to past Muanina elders and the Muanina community as a whole, as the traditional custodians of this land, the land on which I'm joining you all today. And I extend that once again to the several Tasmanian Aboriginal communities who are the contemporary custodians of this land today and who care for this land as if it were our own. So I'd also like to acknowledge my fellow panellists who are joining from many different countries. Zara joining from the Eora Nation, and then we also have Darug country and Wajak land. So pay my deepest respects to those communities and the thousands of generations of knowledge that have been passed and loved and cared for on those lands. Also, this is National Child Protection Week, so I just want to acknowledge and pay respect to our little ones. It's through them that culture is kept alive and strong, and without them and without their safety, our collective futures as First Peoples are further threatened. So this is for them. This is all for them. Thank you, Zara.
Thank you, Ruben. That was a very beautiful acknowledgement to country, and I'm so glad that you're here with us today. Before I begin in introducing this session, I would love to cover a few housekeeping items. For everyone's awareness, all webinars will be recorded and posted on our website in the coming weeks. The chat function is enabled for questions, so if you can see on the right-hand side of your computer, please feel free to submit them throughout the webinar. These are privatized and can only be accessed by the moderators. We will endeavour to answer as many questions as possible, covering a good range. The chat function can also be found at the top of your screen, and links will be posted throughout the webinar to address any resources that our incredible panellists will provide. The webinar is in listen-only mode, so all participants are muted except for our incredible panellists. Closed captions are available and can be enabled by clicking the CC icon at the bottom right of your computer. If you are experiencing any issues, please refer to the FAQs posted in the chat or contact our NAPCAN support team at 02 8073 3300 and a team member will assist you. Alternatively, you can email contact@napcan.org.au for any further questions or concerns. Now, welcome everyone. My name is Zara Al-Hilali and I'm the lead for National Child Protection Week this year. It's been such an honour to curate some of these sessions, and I knew it was absolutely important to bring together some amazing young people that I have had the pleasure of working with to speak about this relevant and nuanced topic. I know young people's voices remain to be excluded across many different discussions. And these three panelists joining us today are some of the most incredible advocates that I've had the pleasure of working with, listening, and learning from as well. They bring such a deep-rooted nuance to the discussions of ingraining and amplifying the voices of young people in these relevant issues. In today's webinar, we will discuss and explore the critical intersections between indigeneity, race, gender, socioeconomic status, disability, and how these factors profoundly impact experiences of child abuse and neglect. As we delve into these complex layers, our goal is to really foster meaningful dialogue that highlights the necessity for inclusive action plans, ones that truly collaborate with and respect the lived experience of young people in our prevention strategy. This session is really designed for you to walk away with some practical skills and knowledge that are vital to understanding, identifying, and responding to the signs of child abuse or neglect. And hey, let's not forget, young people are not a monolith. So make sure you've got your notepads and your pens to start taking notes about how we can support all young people from a diversity of different backgrounds. We'll also be discussing the importance of implementing accountability mechanisms that are so crucial to addressing the needs of diverse and intersectional young people and upholding their rights. But before I begin, I also wanted to provide a trigger warning. The topics that we will be discussing today include child abuse, neglect, suicide, and self-harm, and how these issues often intersect with layers of indigeneity, race, gender, socioeconomic status, and disability. These are sensitive and potentially distressing issues, and we acknowledge that they may evoke strong emotions or memories for some participants. If at any point during the webinar you find yourself feeling overwhelmed, I really encourage you to step away and take the necessary steps to look after yourself. Your mental health and your emotional well-being is so important, and we encourage you to prioritize it throughout this session. If you find yourself needing immediate support or someone to talk to, NAPCAN has posted some links in the chat box, and we'll also be available behind the scenes to readily support you where we can. Thank you so much for joining us and for your commitment to improving young people's needs and upholding the rights of their voices during this National Child Protection Week. Now, I am so excited to introduce the beautiful panel that I'm joined with today. When I was first designing this panel discussion, I was really thinking about different voices that could contribute to different intersectional needs of diverse young people. And these three speakers have continued to break every status quo in early prevention education and child protection systems and listening and amplifying the voices of young people. With that, I might kick off with an introduction. Angelica, why don't you kick us off with a brief introduction of who you are, your work, and why you're joining us here today?
Thank you. Pardon me. Thank you so much, Zara. And I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which I'm joining from, the land of the Wadamadigal people of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured this land for thousands of years. And in this conversation around intersecting identities, intersectionality, the experience of young people, children and young people, it is pertinent that we always acknowledge that first and foremost in these discussions. So by way of introduction, my name is, of course, Angelica Ojanaka Salakis. I always like to introduce myself with saying that I'm an agitator, I'm a carer, I'm a young person, I'm an advocate, and quite frankly, I'm a believer in the vision of young people and the way that young people are changing and shaping the world, are contributing to a variety of perspectives. And that's the world in which I love to sit in. It's the world in which I live and breathe. What's paramount to me and why I introduce myself this way is because young people don't come into spaces like this and have these conversations just because it's fun. it's a sense of urgency and necessity. And that's why I agitate. I agitate in the different work that I do across many spaces. And I do it because of the lived experiences I've had individually, through the connection with various systems at one time, but then also what I see in my own personal life as a carer and how young people with disabilities or young people in general don't get the supports that they need in the ways that they define. So that's culminated in me being, immersed in the world of research, of advocacy for a few years now, and also being the previous in 2022, I had the privilege of being the Australian Youth Representative to the United Nations, and that was a moment where, selfishly speaking, for my community, is something that I always am proud to speak of. That I got the opportunity to be part of, not because of title, but because of the spaces in which people like me could be seen. So that's really me, and I guess I will pass over back to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Angelica. That was a very beautiful introduction. And if I can just say, I really echo and resonate with you so deeply when you say we don't do this work because we want to. This is an urgent, urgent issue that goes beyond want. It's all tied to need. It's all tied to driving and representing the voices of our communities within spaces that have previously and continue to exclude young people's voices. So Angelica, I'm with you today, and I am so excited to hear you share your beautiful thoughts in this space. Reuben, my brother, over to you for a brief introduction.
Thank you so much, sis. And Angelica, that introduction was so powerful and so moving, and along with Zara, and I'm sure Gabriel, I echo that a lot. So a bit about me. My name is Ruben Jack on the screen, but that's because of my name in the organisation. My name's actually Ruben Sheriff. And as I said before, I'm a proud Pakeha man, um, based in Lutruwita, Tasmania. I wear many hats, but mostly I'm a National Youth Advisor here at NAPCAN, through the NAPCAN Youth Speak Out team. NAPCAN Youth Speak Out is known as NISO, and we're a collective of about 17 or so young people. Um, and really, we advocate for the safety of young people in all aspects. Primarily, we contribute to the revision of respectful relationships, consent, and sex education formulated by NAPCAN through their Love Bites education program. And we engage directly with key stakeholders in this space. We also extend our consultation services to organisations and government sectors nationwide, and we also contribute directly to policy reform and advocacy within the sector. Um, Outside of my work with NAPCAN, which I'm very privileged to take part in, I'm also a third year Bachelor of Social Work student at the University of Tasmania. So as a social work minded person, I'm really interested in and passionate about keeping young people safe more generally. Um, I'm currently in a provisional social worker role until December. I started this week actually, and yeah, I just like to promote well-being, balance, and strengths really. It might sound big picture and super optimistic, but I am really passionate about evoking systemic level change. So overall, I just feel really privileged to be here today, in some pretty extraordinary company, and I'm just really looking forward to having a good yarn with you all. So I'll pass it back to you, sis. Yeah, that's a bit about me.
Thank you, my brother. I really appreciate that beautiful introduction. And I have personally had the privilege of working alongside Ruben over the last 2 years, and I can attest that he is one of the most incredibly powerful young people that I've worked with in this space. Ruben consistently emboldens what it means to be so powerful and be so bold and passionate about issues that affect First Nations voices. So, more power to you, my brother, and I'm excited to hear you shed your light in this space. Gabriel, why don't you introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Gabriel Osborne. I use he, him pronouns. I just want to start by saying that I'm coming here from Wajak Noongar land, and I just want to highlight the current crisis in WA with imprisoning Aboriginal children in really horrific, inhumane, and torturous conditions. And I just want to call on the WA government to take immediate action to end that and stop imprisoning Aboriginal children. Just want to mention that's not my own lived experience, but it just feels important to add right now. So yeah, I'm a lived experience advocate for mental health and alcohol and other drug services reform, and also for LGBTQIA plus protection, specifically around gay conversion practices and the harms that they cause. I have my own lived experience of childhood abuse and neglect, of LGBTQIA plus conversion practices within institutional out-of-home care. And I've also been able to co-found Flying Free, which is a not-for-profit dedicated to individual and systemic advocacy for individuals who've experienced mistreatment from the private kind of mental health AOD sector. Yeah, I wanted to, sorry, I'm trying to think of what I wanted to say. Last year I was the recipient of the 2023 Australian Human Rights Award for Young People, which was really amazing, and was very appreciative of that. I'm also next year accepted to start studying a Bachelor of Arts in Law and Society at UWA, which is really exciting. I'm also autistic and still live with PTSD, and am very fortunate to be on the National Disability Insurance Scheme. But there are currently issues with that scheme, and I think a lot of children are kind of being targeted in that way of reducing that scheme, and I think that could cause a lot of harm to children in Australia with disabilities. And so I'm sure Angelica might speak more to disability issues around children, but that's definitely something currently that I'm personally concerned about, as it also affects my well-being as a participant on that scheme. Yeah, hopefully that shares a bit about me. So I'll pass it back to Zara.
Thanks, Gabriel. That's a wonderful introduction, and congratulations on your studies. I am so excited to see where you go next. When I first started this planning, Gabriel and I had jumped on I guess it was probably over an hour call, and we were thinking about these different and unique ways to really help the audience understand intersectionality. And this is why I'm so excited to be jumping into the first part of this webinar, which really aims to provide the audience with a real understanding of intersectionality and the various parts and layers of our identity that can affect how we access early prevention education and how child protection systems can actually discriminate against First Nations communities, refugee and immigrant communities, queer communities, etc. So, Angelica, why don't you kick us off? I know we speak about systemic biases and systemic discrimination, and this is such a big word, and it's particularly a big word, especially amongst many young people. So, I wonder if you could first of all really explain to the audience what are systemic biases, but if you could also identify ways in which systemic biases within social services or protection systems might overlook or address the needs of young people with intersectional identities. How well do you think these social services understand and address the cultural and intersectional complexities affecting these young diverse people as well?
Hmm. It's a very big question, and one that we really need to start off with understanding the definitions and what we're talking about. Because I often hear people talk about systemic or systems and biases, intersectionality, and conflates a lot of different terms and not getting to the core of what we are talking about when we're talking about intersectionality. So, intersectionality and systemic biases go hand in hand together. Um, Often the kind of conception of intersectionality is focused on these individual parts of oneself. I hope people leave this, webinar really understanding that intersectionality is not about the separation of our parts of ourselves. It is actually about the compounded bit, the bit that interlinks, the bit that where all the different, if you have all these arrows that point together into one small spot, intersectionality is about that, how that comes together for all of us. But importantly, if you think about that spot within a square, the square is the system. The square are the structures in which this spot has to navigate and move around. And that's where our systemic biases and systemic injustices emerge, when we do not support that compounded interlinking experience that children and young people have. Intersectionality is about the isms. It's not just about the identity. It's about when we're talking about systemic, we're talking about the isms of racism, the isms of ableism, the isms of everything really that we know, and the phobias as well. All of those things is what intersectionality is pointing to. What is someone's experience of having to navigate systems and structures that overlook all of those isms and phobias for myself or any other individual? And what does that mean for me in terms of the supports in my life outside? So if I take myself, for example, maybe visibly you'll see, I'm a young Nigerian person. I have darker skin. I also have my own experiences that you cannot see in regards to disability, that I often don't always talk about, for many different reasons of what the experience of ableism is. But all of these things about me and many other things also to do with class, and other lived experiences come together as one piece. I cannot separate those things out. And what happens, unfortunately, within social services and systems is this tendency to try to force young people or children to separate these parts of themselves out. I cannot deprioritize myself and the experiences I have as a woman. I cannot deprioritize my experiences when it comes to race, when it comes to ability, etc. And to your point in your question around being overlooked, I also think it's important for us to define what overlooked means in the context of systemic biases and intersectionality. When you have that compounded whole of yourself and you're navigating the world, and interacting with many different things, unfortunately, for a lot of children and young people, there are parts of themselves and their whole experiences that are overlooked. And when we say overlooked, we mean there's a failure, actually, a failure to spot, to notice, to see, to respect, to realize, to actualize, and a failure to actually transform the experiences that young children and young people are going through. That is what it means to be overlooked. It's not just this one thing of just noticing or just seeing, it's all of those things together. And right now, unfortunately, children and young people are having shared experiences of feeling helpless within systems that are, again, overlooking, lacking that respect and realization and actualization of their whole needs, of their compounded self. And young people feeling a lack of control over, the opportunities, the services, the supports, the learning that they're afforded to, for, again, they're presenting compounded experiences. And so for me, I think when we talk about being able to identify ways to actually go beyond, beyond the status quo, which is ignoring these compounded experiences, we really have to realize that you used the word monolith before, Zara. Young people are expressing a difficulty of having to navigate specific services that are catered to one particular type of experience, and a uniformity is the word that I would use. So if I point to the example of young people from different cultural backgrounds, and again, within that experience, there are many other things that compound together. The challenge and lack of consideration around cultural diversity, and attempting to apply one model to what young people with different cultural backgrounds may need within different systems. And again, not accounting for the other isms that those young people have to interact with. There's a presumption that this uniformity works for us. It does not. In fact, the lack of kind of cultural specificity means that for us, children and young people, we feel like it's our responsibility to adjust to the system. It's our responsibility to essentially be adherence to the services, policies, and that reciprocation of care and support that actually takes into account our unique experiences isn't being met. And when that happens over time and over time, that's where biases come in, and we just operate the same way. And so I know I've said a lot, but I really think it's important for us to address intersectionality clearly, because we do need to think about how children and young people within social services are experiencing inconsistent interactions. They're experiencing rigidity. They're experiencing a lack of opportunity to exercise choice in how their compounded experiences are reflected. And there's this overemphasis, actually, maybe not overemphasis, but this primary focus on risk mitigation rather than actually elevating the priorities and the unmet needs that young people are pointing to. And we want that to happen in a non-discriminatory and a non-judgmental way, but unfortunately that's not the case. So yeah, I've said many different things, but if I can sum up with that question is, when you have biases that remain, children and young people continue to feel that they're at service to the system. And that's the reality of what we're experiencing right now, that they have to justify their existence within systems, and that they're having to fit a mold of a system that is service determined rather than children and young people determined. That's what we're seeing in the justice system and everything that's happening right now across the country. The experiences of young people within, and I say justice with quotation marks, I should say, where young people having to fit into a system that's defined by without them in mind. So let's rethink uniformity. Let's rethink the hierarchy of children and young people within systems. Let's address these biases that, again, limit our full scope of the compounding experiences that young people have. And I hope for a world where we're not at service to the system anymore.
Thank you, Angelica. That was beautiful. Nothing about us without us. And I think that exactly encapsulates everything that you've spoken about. When I was actually designing this session, I recall speaking to a few people in the community about intersectionality. And one of the questions that I had received was, what's intersectionality? What does it mean? And I think this definition that you've provided, particularly in reference to systemic biases and what a systems model looks like, is so perfectly articulated. So thank you so much for those definitions. And I see some of the comments that unfortunately others can't see, that this is a discussion that has been ongoing within the child protection system, but one that sometimes we don't have the understanding to really define or to really find those concrete words, because identity is so complex as well. So powerfully said, Angelica. Ruben, I might pass it over to you. We had a good yarn a few weeks ago about identity, particularly in, working amongst your community and within systems, and sometimes having that difficult dynamic. How do you navigate the sometimes conflicting expectations or pressures that come from different aspects of your identity, especially when working to reform diverse young people's experiences of abuse or neglect?
Well, Zara, that's a really good question, actually. And yeah, I'm stoked that that's been asked. It's something that I personally don't think is amplified enough within this space. It's definitely spoken about from myself, from Black colleagues, but it's really not amplified enough by allies in this space, by anybody else in this space. So I'm really keen to chat about this a little bit. There's obviously a lot of nuance to be held within a discussion or a response to a question like that. So I just probably want to acknowledge right off the bat that I only speak from my own experience and for myself in this regard. But to be quite frank, yeah, it can be very difficult to navigate the intersecting expectations that come from different aspects of my identity within this space. On one side, as a Black fella, there can be confusion or uncertainty within community as to why I do what I do. It can be seen as really positive that there's one of us in this space. But then, as I said before, questions can and do arise as to exactly why I am in this space. The notion of child protection is not associated with positive regard for mob. We know that this sector has perpetuated harm, pain, trauma, and utter and complete disrespect to our First Peoples and our communities. And at the end of the day, despite the ethos of the sector and some of the work that is done now, my Aboriginality does not negate that I'm still choosing to work in this space and in a sector that has such a fraught relationship with my own peoples. So I'm an Indigenous fella, I'm Pakana, as I said before, and I'm working in this space. To some, it seems contradictory and almost a little bit paradoxical. To others, it's seen as a really good thing, but those two truths can exist very legitimately at once. In my view, we need to be in this space, and we need to have our voices heard and have those in power listen to us, especially in regard to the global agenda of decolonising and indigenising white spaces, which I was so glad to have you pay a nod to in your introduction, Zara. But we need to do that if the perception of this sector, and more importantly, the cruel and inhumane treatment of our Black kids, is to improve. So at the end of the day, I'm always going to be an Indigenous person, and those are the values that I carry with me deep in my heart and at every stride, through every step I take. These guide my work inherently, and they are inextricable from who I am as a human. They can't ever be abandoned. But despite this, sometimes Blackness, the notion of Blackness, Aboriginality, it's met with resistance within social work and child protection spaces. It's very common for a lot of us. The harsh truth is that many organisations enjoy the perceived social progression of employing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but don't truly enjoy nor value the depth of our worldviews and values beyond mere tokenism. So as I said before, and to more specifically get to the core of your question, Zara, on one hand, I have the potential for confusion, criticism, and questioning from community when it is known that I work within this space, or I'm in public forums such as this, or for what is perceived to be aligning so closely with what is a very white sector and space. And then on the other hand, more importantly to acknowledge, I have pressure to conform to white ways of being, doing, and knowing within the workspace, because sometimes my unashamed and my unapologetic Blackness is too much. So I just want to preface, I currently work for NAPCAN, and this isn't my experience within NAPCAN, my current organisation, but it is an experience within many other departments and many other disciplines. So it's herein where the intersection, I guess, of these pressures and expectations, etc., where that's really identified. There's a lot to resist and navigate, to be quite frank. For mob, there are the sometimes conflicting expectations from within community, but more pressing is the need to resist white supremacy culture that is really embedded within the fabric of some organisational and disciplinary cultures. For me, as I said before, it's about leading with my heart deep in here, and doing so in reflection of our old ways, because that's exactly what the ancestors did. And so in my work, I have to act with pride and integrity and confidence in this matter. To complement that, I have to stand strong in what it is I do and how it is I do it, and to be satisfied with this standalone, which at present I feel lucky to say that I am. But I'm always open to change and different ways of being and doing, and I think that that's really important in this space. And I respect that advocacy can be done in many different ways by many different people who have their own intersections and come from different vantage points, because ultimately it's going to take all of us and many different ways of being and doing and knowing to contribute to what is really much needed systemic change efforts. We all need to be listened to.
It's beautifully said, Ruben. Thank you for those insights. I'm very keen to chat about strategies moving forward because I think there's so much that needs to be done, and particularly after the horrific news that is coming out of Western Australia, so many strategies need to be in place. And I think, particularly, I can only imagine we've had this yarn before as a First Nations Pakana man yourself. There is consistent calls to action, but not enough delivery of these calls to action as well. So I'm keen to discuss what meaningful engagement also looks like later on in this webinar. I appreciate your bringing your heart to your sleeve today. Gabriel, I'll pass over to you. I know you've led some incredible campaigns in Western Australia, and you've been such a leading voice for the inclusion, particularly of LGBTQIA plus young people within these spaces. Do you feel there is adequate representation of resources available to support young people and children with intersectional identities within the child protection space?
Yeah, absolutely not. Definitely isn't. But I think to kind of be able to understand why they are actually so needed, we kind of need to actually look at what those intersectional experiences are. I can only really speak to my own lived experience and those that I've kind of know about through my own community. And so what I might do is share a little bit about my own lived experience and how intersectionality came into that. And then I think you'll see quite clearly how there was a lack of representation and how that could have helped. And so I'm going to share, a bit of my own lived experience and also quote some statistics that I've found that kind of explain why it would be so important to have that representation. So I actually grew up in regional and rural areas of Western Australia, and also grew up as a queer child, which caused a lot of difficulty for me. I grew up with very very little representation, and the representation I did have was usually very negative, and it was usually any individual people I could see being represented were people who were being harassed or assaulted, or who were really not doing well because of kind of their life as an out person. I experienced significant bullying and abuse from both students and teachers throughout my education experiences. And when I was 15 and experiencing significant mental illness, was sent to a religious rehabilitation residential program, and was held there and experienced pretty significant conversion practices, which were really kind of horrific. And so I think that it's really important to acknowledge the additional risks that LGBTQIA plus children have. Statistics kind of show that LGBTQIA plus children are more likely to experience all forms of abuse and neglect. 90% of gender diverse young people have experienced at least one form of abuse or neglect. And this statistic was quite shocking to me and really disturbing, which is that 50% of trans and gender diverse children and young people have been sexually abused, which is just a horrifically high number. And researchers kind of believe that might be because of the additional risks and the additional vulnerabilities that children who present outside of the norms of gender or sexuality, and how they can become targets, which is also compounded by the increase in their own social isolation from their peers and desire for acceptance because it's something they're not getting from their families. We know that 43% of LGBTQIA plus young people said their family was not supportive when they came out, which is pretty horrific of a number. So almost half felt not supportive. And that ties into, I think, the rates of abuse and neglect. I personally became homeless after leaving residential care, and I'm not alone because 26% of LGBT young people who have been homeless said that it was related to their LGBT identity. 45% said it was due to family rejection, and 43% due to family violence. And so we can tell that these are really big issues for the LGBTQIA plus community. I think one of the areas I really want to touch on when it comes to representation is we know that a lot of children and young people will report that they are experiencing abuse or mistreatment in their lives at school. And for LGBTQIA plus people, we found that this isn't really as much of an option. And so 60% of LGBTQIA plus teenagers said they felt unsafe or uncomfortable at school. And the statistics also found that school is the number one place where they're most likely to actually experience verbal and physical harassment and assault because of their gender and sexuality. And so we know that school is usually the place where children have the opportunity to report that they're being mistreated, usually in their home. And we now know that LGBTQIA plus people are more likely to experience that at home, but they're also more likely to experience it at school and not be able to have anyone to report that to. The WA, I think it was actually the federal government, recently stated that they would not be adding in discrimination protections for LGBTQIA plus people within education, within religious education, and that it would be still allowed to fire teachers for being LGBTQA plus or expel students. And this is just further compounding that issue. And additionally, being in regional areas, there just isn't the same resources for children and young people who are experiencing mistreatment. A lot of it also is, again, really unfortunately being targeted towards Aboriginal people. And I found that as a white person in the community, I had a friend who was Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, and being her friend and seeing her family was so amazing. And it showed me, seeing how amazing her family was, that how I was being treated wasn't right. But my family wasn't the one being looked at. It was her family who was being looked at because she was Black. And it was just really kind of a really crap situation. And I guess, I wanted to share that, those intersectional issues are really important. And I think in regional areas, the government will often pour money into maybe getting more LGBT resources out there, or getting more resources out regionally, or more resources for people with disabilities. But then what about the people in regional Australia who are also LGBTQA plus and also have a disability? Where are they getting their representation? I think that's one of the things that I think Angelica was speaking about, around how that coming all together, that intersectionality creates a unique kind of experience. And so, I wanted to, I guess, share that for now, and that also these increased rates of abuse and harassment and homelessness will all be compounded. And the studies show that those rates all increase if you add on disability, add on regional or rural living, and add on being a person of colour and being LGBT. All those statistics increase more. And so it's a really complex issue, but that's basically why that representation is so important. And hopefully I'll get to share a bit later on about what specific strategies we need to put in place to actually increase that representation. Thank you. I'll pass back to Zara.
Thanks, Gabriel. That was incredible. And I think you did such an amazing job at really highlighting how intersectionality isn't a one-size-fits-all approach as well. And I think you've really beautifully taken us to the next part of the panel, which is about understanding how we can utilize intersectionality to provide lived experience strategies that are not only inclusive to diverse young people, but by also recognizing that intersectionality doesn't mean that we apply a homogenous approach to young people from specific backgrounds. And Angelica, you spoke about it so beautifully, about highlighting that intersectionality is really about this connection. But Gabriel, again, I think you did such a beautiful job at really reminding us all here today that intersectionality is also then about recognizing that not all young people have that same connecting point. So, Angelica, I might pass over to you first. And before I provide you with your question that I'd love to, hear you speak about strategies of lived experience, I wanted to provide a small story about Angelica. I didn't actually get to start working with Angelica until last year probably, but I remember when she was announced as the Australian representative to the United Nations, the Australian Young Representative, apologies. I was so in awe that Australia finally had a multicultural Black woman who had worked directly within Western Sydney communities, who looked like me and were a part of low socioeconomic communities like myself. And I remember being so in awe that we finally had this representation that would bring the voices of young people. And if anyone has had a read of Angelica's report of this United Nations program that she was a part of, you'll find that she specifically spoke with a diverse diversity of young people nationwide, particularly as well young people from refugee backgrounds who have also experienced out of home care as well. So, Angelica, given your lived experience and given your ability to have spoken with young people nationwide across a variety of different intersectional backgrounds, I wonder if you can possibly address how child protection systems should better tailor their interventions to address the specific intersectional needs for young people and children from refugee backgrounds.
Hmm. Firstly, thank you, Zara. That was so unexpected, but then also, again, uh, this forum is an example of what happens when you bring young people with different experiences together. You have the answers right here, and part of the answers, actually, I should say. And so, thank you again for for allowing me to really just share what I've heard. But um, I want to kind of break this down into like three areas, and then also just share my kind of lived experience to this. And so I think that one of the things that's really kind of um, surprising and then sometimes not surprising is how little people actually know of when you ask them, what are you referring to when you're saying young people with different cultural backgrounds, or young people who are refugee, or young people who are migrant, or young people who are asylum seeker? If you ask yourselves, do you know what those four things mean? That's a starting point to begin with. Is that if you actually don't understand what it is to have what those definitions are, if you don't understand the data of ethnicity, of language, of religion, of um, of race, and if you don't understand what the data is around um, who these young people are to begin with, that is an important starting point. You need to know who you're referring to. You need to know the young people that you are providing supports for. You need to know what their experiences are, both in what it quantitatively says, but then also the many, many thousands of stories that have already been shared from young children and young people who are of refugee and migrant background and are navigating various systems at one time. So that's a kind of policy beginning, if I should say, of what you should be doing to really understand who you're talking to. Um, the other thing that I think that is really important when it comes to, I guess, how we tailor the needs, how we kind of tailor the needs of this particular cohort in, I guess, child protection systems and services, is to look at your workforce. Who actually is, who are the people who are connecting to this group in particular? Um, and I mean that with all due respect, but I say this because a lot of young people will talk about, I don't have connection to people of my particular cultural background, or I want the choice. I just want the choice. Like, it doesn't have to, I'm not saying that we go and hire everyone of particular backgrounds into this space. That's not the solution. But young people, children and young people, just sometimes want the avenue and the agency to be able to choose who they're interacting with. What does our workforce look like in this space? Does it actually look like these young people from refugee and migrant backgrounds? If it's not, and I'm talking about the whole workforce, I'm talking about youth workers, I'm talking about, caseworkers, I'm talking about everything. If it doesn't, then okay, how are you actually investing in the interests of this particular group? And this is not just in your interactions with them when they come into contact with the system. Outside of the system, how are we actually investing in the interests and the things that children and young people from refugee and migrant backgrounds love to do? How are you immersing yourselves in those things? There's understandings of culture, there's understandings of the compounding experience of race and class and etc. altogether. We need to actually spend time really unpacking that for ourselves in our workforce as well, if we're going to really start tailoring anything. Um, the other thing that I think at a kind of service level or now at a service level specifically, is really unpacking there's a difference between being culturally competent and there's a difference between actually being culturally responsive. And I think that those two things are really important for us to understand in the child protection space as well. It is not good enough from the perspective of a lot of children and young people for you to just be merely aware of us and our existence and leave it at that. It is not good enough to just be competent. Competent has an endpoint. Really, in this system, we should be desiring and continuing to build relationships that are genuine, authentic, and actually build that responsiveness. How are you responding to us? The amount of times and stories of young people who share that they're kind of left on a cliffhanger around their needs. I've expressed this. I've expressed that I would like this in this particular way. But then a decision is made or they never come, those young people are never hear back, or their kind of needs are having to be repeated again and again and again. So when you're having young people who have to repeat themselves to young people who aren't even hearing back in the first place, we're not responding. So let's build strategies together again with those communities around how do we actually be culturally responsive to each other in this system. And then also build that sensitivity as well. That's how when you are responsive and you actually hear from different perspectives and actually lean into transformation, that's when the cultural sensitivity builds. So that's another thing. And then the third thing, in terms of tailoring needs, before I quickly say my lived experience, is it's really important for us to, one, I think we've all heard the word co-design many times. I think that it's important for us to realize that co-design is only one part of the process. There is many parts of co-design. It's how you begin to think about tailoring to start off with. Where does the ideation of that, then jumping into co-design, then jumping into co-delivering, then jumping into co-evaluating. And there's a lot of times young people from refugee and migrant backgrounds are not involved in the evaluation piece. That whole process together is how you actually tailor needs. So really centering voices in that way is how we can actually, I guess, address that marginalization piece. And from my own lived experiences, I'm not going to don't have all the time to tell my life story, but if there's one thing that I remember that I hold dear is the memories of the staff and people who interacted with me. And my lived experience, I think, is other connected systems like the family law system, etc. That while I haven't been in out of home care, etc., I definitely have experiences that are very much connected to that. But it's the people who actually sat down and listened to me and saw that I was human. That is what sticks with me. It's the reason why I then feel like I have purpose and I actually am seen more of just a number and a person in the courtroom that people are dealing with. I'm a human being. And refugee and migrant communities are in this country and globally are still facing and currently facing immense dehumanization. So really start to think about in practice, how do we stop that? Because that's what sticks with us, particularly our group. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Angelica. I always feel so emotional whenever I hear you speak because I share so much of your story in my own, and I think just being seen as a human, particularly in the continuous rhetoric nationwide about multicultural communities, refugee communities, being seen as alienated populations continues to remind us that we have so much work that needs to be done. So I thank you for sharing a bit of your story today. Goodness, I feel so emotional. Gabriel, I'll go back to you first. I know you spoke about, wanting to provide a bit of strategies. So I guess I'd love to dig your brain a bit. What strategies do you think are most effective in empowering young people who face multiple layers of marginalisation due to their intersecting identities? I know you spoke about different layers of your identity being connected, so I'd love to hear how we ensure that young people from these diverse backgrounds feel supported to speak out against issues of abuse and neglect, especially when there is still so much ongoing tokenization and stigma within discussing child abuse and neglect, especially as young people.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's ridiculous. There's so many things I want to speak about. It's crazy. I might just start by, I kind of want to parrot something that Angelica said that I connected to so much and absolutely loved and wanted to add on to, which was around the whole co-design thing, and how I think co-design as well, I want to say, is incredibly important and ultimately what should be the mainstream in really any social service type thing. That should be the standard. But I also want to mention that is different from like consultation. I think I've been a part of many co-design workshops and things, and sometimes really it's just a one-off 1 hour Zoom meeting, which isn't really co-design, that's more consultation. And also the evaluation on the end is also incredibly important. I wanted to give an example of a really good experience I've had with co-design and what that looked like, and kind of explain why that was so effective, which was with Telethon Kids Institute in WA. And they invited me to help co-design for a residential youth service for young people who were experiencing thoughts of suicide. And it wasn't one meeting, it was many, it was probably about 3 different meetings talking about all the different aspects of what this service would look like. My feedback was then taken and reviewed and sent back to me to comment on further. I was then able to review at the end, and I was also invited back to be able to be a youth representative on their hiring panel when they were actually hiring the staff for that service, to be able to ask questions specifically to provide what I believed those staff members need, how they needed to be to protect and do the best job that they could do. And that was a really fantastic look. And it wasn't just me, it was many, many different young people, and also people who are family members of those young people and clinical professionals all had a say. And it was, I just think, a really great example of how that was done. And I really appreciated being a part of that, and want to say that was a great example. I just wanted to add that. But then I also wanted to add how this issue, specifically for the LGBT community, it's not really one area. It's actually more of a systemic and societal problem. There are a lack of discrimination laws in place, and so it kind of makes it tough to protect children when actually systemically they're just not protected. It's very hard when there actually aren't really laws in place to protect them. Gay conversion practices are still legal in many states in Australia, and that can include practices that are actually just abuse and like more physical abuse as well. And it's just the fact that we still allow it means that there isn't really a pathway for someone to report abuse or neglect because it's allowed to happen to them. And I think that's the case as well. We've seen with the prison, like the criminal justice system, criminal justice, and other ways of when it's actually legal to happen, it's really hard to take steps to kind of end it when there's those systemic kind of failures in place. And I think that it's also important to remember an area with LGBT young people that make it a little different than some others is that often when you're dealing with systemic discrimination, possibly because of like race or something, not in all cases, but in quite a few, it's something that you're dealing with within your family. So you may have your parents who also are part of that identity and who can, I guess, somewhat, again, in some cases probably not, but provide some level of support in knowing who you are. And even though you're facing that discrimination, kind of holding that understanding with, at least within your community. But LGBT people often don't have that because they're still discovering their identity as they're growing. And it's not an identity they share with anyone around them. They're also being told by the media and by society that there's something wrong with them, or that they're not important, or that there's whatever it may be. There's also a denial of their necessary medical care, especially with trans kids. There's been a lot of pushback against what is actually determined by scientists that say this is the care that's needed, but you're allowed to just refuse it. If you have a child who is trans and who really, really needs medical care because of that, and the medical science is saying, yep, you need that care, that is what will save your life because it'll protect your mental health, it'll protect your future, and your family or people around you are saying, no, we don't want you to have that, even if it would be life-saving, there isn't a mechanism to say, that's not really okay. It just is accepted that you're not allowed to have the necessary care that you need. And there's just so many areas where, it's just it's an ongoing issue. But yeah, I think that a big thing would be systemic changes, but also training. We've started getting training in police and teachers and social workers and nurses around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. Again, it's not nearly enough, but there's something there, at least a little bit. We're starting to get a little bit, but it's still nowhere near enough. And it's also often optional. But we don't really have any training in university that is mandatory on other groups, and I think likely many groups of people. And I think it's important that is more tailored around what different communities there are, and more training within how to work with different communities is really important. And then of course, more representation and government programs and strategies, specifically getting into those regional areas, I think is really important, and acknowledging all the different types of people that exist. I might leave it there. I don't know how long I've been talking to, but I'll stop there. But hopefully that was helpful.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. There are so many beautiful messages in the chat echoing your sentiments, and I hope everyone had a pen and paper down, because every time I speak to you, Gabriel, I learn more and more about how we must continue to create strategies in place that protect LGBTQI communities and young people. Ruben, look, I think in this question, it is so important for us to recognise that we cannot speak about National Child Protection Week without addressing that First Nations children continue to be discriminatively incarcerated. We know the statistics. Indigenous children are 24 times more likely to be incarcerated than non-Indigenous children. Let me repeat that again. Indigenous children are 24 times more likely to be incarcerated than non-Indigenous children. So, Ruben, how does the history of distrust between Indigenous communities and law enforcement impact the way young Indigenous people view child protection systems, and what can be done to build this trust, especially when we know that these systems continue to discriminate against First Nations children?
Thank you, Zara. I want to reinforce that point. We know the statistics of First Nations children being incarcerated, and Indigenous children are 24 times more likely than non-Indigenous children, and that is a national disgrace. It is utterly a national disgrace. I touched on this before, but obviously the relationship between First Peoples and government is fraught. This is not because we are inherently criminal peoples. That's not possible. Like, legitimately, that is not possible. Rather, there are multitudes of systemic factors that are at play, that act as agents of neocolonialism to maintain our suppression. If our suppression is maintained, we're silenced. And if we're silenced, we cannot advocate against the colony. This is, of course, not new. The first people of Australia, my ancestors, our brothers and sisters, our mob nationwide, have been subject for over 200 years to an extensive history of overrepresentation within the prison system, ever since the British forcefully and falsely asserted ownership of what is now known as Australia. To keep us imprisoned is to keep us out of sight and out of mind so that the colonial agenda can progress. And that is very deliberate. For us, child protection systems are seen to be much the same. If our children are not with us, if they are not with their families, with their communities on their country, they're left to languish in the devastating reality of cultural disconnection. And that is the ultimate goal. They want our kids to be culturally disconnected. Either way, if a child is in out-of-home care, if a child is under youth justice supervision in prison, you know, our kids are still experiencing cultural disconnection. So either way, the government systems that are at play here, they're removing our kids. That's at the crux of this matter. So, historical and intergenerational thinking and trauma, I guess, impacts our level of engagement with government and impacts our level of trust with government. And that must always be at the fore of our thinking when it comes to considering, I guess, exactly how and why this strong history of distrust might even be present in the first place, and further to how this impacts the way in which our communities view other government systems, like, as I say, child protection. Angelica, before you mentioned the family law system. This is across the board. But you ask what can be done to build trust, Zara. As you said, this is a conversation that cannot be not had. And the answer is multifaceted. As I acknowledged before, and as I think we all agree upon, I'm not a representative of every community, but at the core, I think all of us can agree that we have to pivot from punitive models and work towards systems that are inherently more relational and inherently more holistic in their approach. We have to put the power back into the hands of our communities, back into the hands of our community leaders, and foster collaboration and true, authentic, like Gabriel said before, co-creation with said communities. It can't just be consultation. It can't just be an hour-long Zoom call. It cannot just be a tokenistic tick. True co-creation, rather, tripping over my words a little bit there, must be ensured at every level and at every step. This is non-negotiable. Unfortunately, this just isn't done enough. And the people contributing to decision-making, policy, and legislation about our kids, majority don't have lived experience of what it is like to be an Aboriginal person or to be a child who has been removed from their home. And that comes back to your point before, Angelica, my sister. So real. How can you say that you are acting in the best interests of a child if you are not taking full steps to understand that child and really meet their needs? Ultimately, there isn't a lot of experience across government sectors of Aboriginal people who understand what it is like to live in a settler colonial society. These are white institutions at the core. And so that is in part why Indigenous children are receiving child protection services at far higher rates than non-Indigenous children. I just have a statistic here from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare as of 2022 that Indigenous children receive child protection services at 172 kids per every 1,000 children, compared to 21 kids per 1,000 children for non-Indigenous kids. As I said when I spoke a while back, this is a national disgrace. And as I said again when I spoke a while back, we need to be included in the process, and cultural safety, cultural relevance, and cultural sensitivity at all levels must be ensured. When that happens, then trust can be built. We know our kids best. We've been saying this for years. We always have and we always will. I think a really incredible example of community-focused, community-led, holistic and relational approaches happening can be seen in some areas of youth justice, and I'm speaking specifically in the form of restorative justice. In no way am I speaking about the system as a whole, which continues to impart the same level of trauma and dispossession to our communities. Here I'm talking about restorative justice. Community are involved in this process, and as I said before, it's inherently more relational and holistic. And we see that in comparison to traditional sentencing procedures, restorative justice tends to result in extremely high levels of crime diversion. But unfortunately, not that restorative justice can be applied in child protection, but similar instances with those principles are not being applied. in child protection. It's just not happening enough. More broadly, I'd say that there's hope. We can reflect on the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child placement principle, which seeks to ensure that kids maintain connection with their families, with their communities, with their cultures, and with their countries through culturally appropriate child placements. But still, nationwide, 1 in 3 Black kids are not having this principle adhered to their cases. And unfortunately, that is 1 in 3 kids too many. Um, as I said, whilst there is hope in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child placement principle, there are, of course, areas for improvement. And something I'm particularly passionate about is trying to improve the rates of this occurring in the Northern Territory and Tasmania, because those are the 2 jurisdictions that have astronomically higher rates of disregard for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child placement principle. This is of great concern, obviously for me because I'm from Lutruwita, Tasmania, but also in the Northern Territory for our communities up there, of which there are large Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations. So, before I hand back to you, Zara, I'll just leave one final statement, I think, and that's that we've got to do some pretty major restructuring and some pretty major rethinking because, ultimately, our kids trust their elders. They don't trust law enforcement or the government, and that is ultimately through no doing of their own or their family.
Thank you so much, Ruben. Incredible remarks from you. I think there is so much to learn, so much restructuring to be done. And I think for everyone listening on this call, let us move beyond dialogue and start integrating and lobbying for real action. It is not enough to be listening to young people's voices every National Child Protection Week and continue to reiterate the same issues that affect young people nationwide. Let us call and demand for action to protect young people across all intersectionalities. Now, we do only have a few minutes until the panel discussion wraps up, and unfortunately we don't have enough time to go through some questions, even though I see so many questions coming in. But I guess to end this off, I would love to hear from the panelists about one key call to action that you would like to see decision makers, organisations on this call, governments commit to ahead of protecting all diverse young people. Angelica, I might start with you.
Just one is the real question. And also, I know, there's I'm sure heaps of questions that have come through. I'm sure all 3 of us, not speaking for everyone, but happy to answer questions outside of this as well, if they relate to anything that was shared. Oh, one call to action. I really just want to echo both of what Gabriel and Ruben have said. Connection is paramount to this whole conversation. And if I think about the communities that I guess represent the parts of my compounding experience, and also the stories in which young people have shared, is that connection underpins a lot of what's either missing, what is deteriorating for young people, but then also is the ask that a lot of young people are yearning for us to lean into, building true connection in the ways in which young people define them. We need to move away from a solely systems determined and defined approach that is limited of young people's perspectives around connection. And to what Ruben has said, when we deal with the injustice of these systems when it comes to our First Nations communities, that benefits all young people. That really, especially here. So that is a particular call to action. I know that for a lot of young people who from refugee, migrant backgrounds, whatever we do in that space will benefit us in particular. And then speaking as a call to action is I just really would love more of us with our lived experiences in the seats of decision making not just at policy, but within organizations, within community, actually being afforded the opportunity to be part of the whole process in the ways in which this system redefines itself, and to break down the silos. We need to do that. We cannot continue to operate in a siloed system any longer. So let's do that in a practice level. Let's do that in an organization level, and come together as a whole community, all of us who have joined this call and listening in, taking notes, share those notes with your peers. That's how we begin this approach. And I just want to quickly shout out some people who and groups already doing that in some of my work in the lovely world of research, who are coming together as a community of practice, around young people from different backgrounds and intersecting needs. Happy to share those things afterwards, as well. The conversation is existing, but let's make sure young people are centered in that.
Beautifully said. Thank you, Angelica. Gabriel, over to you.
Yeah, well, Angelica kind of took mine, and so I'm just going to I'm going to say something different, but I will say that I completely agree with Angelica, and that definitely would have been that's basically the huge thing. But I think I'll maybe talk kind of my call to action more be around kind of the government and their agreements that they've made to the LGBTQA plus community that they have been turning their back on. Recently, the census, and then also religious discrimination. They've turned their backs on LGBTQA plus people, and they've also turned their back on us in terms of conversion practices and commitments that aren't being followed through, or that we aren't truly being brought into the conversation around what we need. And just generally, it's a societal problem. Homophobia and transphobia are problems within our society. There isn't one kind of sector that it's a big problem in. It's really a problem with us as a society. And so there needs to be much bigger kind of changes to government. And we are not controversial people. We are human beings, and we live in this country, and we deserve the same rights and protections as everyone else. And so I think that any government who is not prioritising our humanity and our human rights, and the fact that we are not confusing, we are not controversial, we are human beings. And so I would call on everyone, all the organisations and everyone to push the government to said what it's originally agreed to do in these areas, and hold them to account if they don't as well. And that would be my call to action, along with obviously what Angelica said. Absolutely, very strongly agree with that. So.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. Again, powerful. Ruben, over to you.
Thank you, everyone. Just before I kick off, I just want to say, as you've all been speaking, I've just been reflecting, and I feel so blessed to be in a space filled with so much passion, knowledge, expertise, vibrance. It's just really incredible, and I'm sure that the entire audience can really attest to that. I agree with both of your calls to action, and so I'll add mine here. I guess my call to action is for policymakers, government, stakeholders, disciplined organisations, everybody within this space to legitimately decolonise and indigenise. One of my favourite research articles by Buck and Yang is called Decolonisation is Not a Metaphor, and I could not agree more. Decolonisation is not a once-off. It is an ongoing process, and as Angelica highlighted before, to decolonise and to indigenize, especially these spaces, benefits all children, benefits every single child. We only have things to gain here. So my call to action is to really commit to decolonisation and indigenizing your practice, indigenizing your theory, indigenizing your workplace, and decolonizing at every point. And really committing to reading about this, engaging with community, doing some learning and educating yourself, because this is not something we can continue to impart we've been screaming for years, and we have been silenced. And so now more than ever, it is on you, mob, to go and be there, and to go and do those things. So that's my call. My call is to decolonize and to indigenize at all levels, and I really hope for a future wherein that vision is realized. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Reuben. This now draws us to the end of National Child Protection Week's Young People webinar. I am so thrilled to be joined by Angelica, Gabriel and Reuben, three powerful advocates joining us across the country with a diversity of lived experience, backgrounds, knowledge and power in decolonising the spaces that they are a part of. As I close the webinar, I really can't help but acknowledge that we must not forget that there are so many young people in the child protection system who should be here speaking with us, who should be here speaking on this panel discussion today. These are the ones that are facing some of the most daunting challenges, yet they are frequently pushed to the periphery of our conversations and our discussions. We cannot afford to overlook their struggles or ignore their needs. It is our collective duty to ensure that these young people are not just remembered but prioritised, and that their perspectives are at the very heart of our conversation. Angelica, Reuben and Gabriel are three powerful voices, but there are so many other voices that continue to be silenced in this space. Let us truly remember that listening is a powerful tool that must be utilised to fiercely advocate for the rights of all children, of all backgrounds. We cannot build a system without listening to the diverse perspectives of all young people and children. Let us continue to pledge to amplify the voices of diverse young people who unfortunately can't be here today, and make sure that they are not indispensable, that they are a part of the solution to fight and to create a world, an Australia, a country that recognises that strategies must continue to embed the lived experience of all intersectional young people. Angelica, Reuben, Gabriel, thank you so much for joining me today. This was a powerful discussion. I am so honoured to be here with three fierce advocates, and I would love for you all to continue to follow their journeys and their work. This webinar will be recorded and it will be posted on our website in the next few weeks. Please stay tuned for the rest of the National Child Protection Week webinars. We have 3 more coming up, and I'm so excited to continue these discussions. Let us make sure that National Child Protection Week and our calls to action don't end on the 7th of September, but they are a priority for every day of this year until we see justice for all children. Thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure to be here today.